and this is our Boulder Book Store happy hour session with Megan Campisi, author of Sin Eaters. Liesl, start us off with your question.
Oh, so you mentioned in your book, in the sort of the author's notes, that there were in fact historical sin eaters, and that this was a thing. And so I kind of wondered how widespread that was, or was it like a small culty, groupy thing, or what happened there?
So that's a really good question. So yes, sin eaters existed in parts of Wales. Now, the historical record is very sparse on the matter. And so I've done as much research as I was able to on them, and there isn't a huge amount. So it was pretty rare. It was much smaller than what I have in the books. So what we know is that a social pariah would come to a funeral and eat a piece of bread or bread and salt on the coffin. And by doing so, take the sins of the dying onto that person's, the sin eater's own soul. And for this, they would get a few coins. And they were regarded as an outcast for doing this, but also probably before then as well. They probably didn't do this job unless they were already pretty down and out. And so I was fascinated by that when I learned about it. And I wanted to write about a sin eater, but in order for my book to work, in order to have a mystery, I needed to have it be a widespread custom and not this very rare thing that was just in pockets and corners of Wales. And I also wanted it to be, rather than just a post-mortem ritual, I wanted it to be more of like a communion between the sin eater and the person who's dying, so that there would be more of an exchange, and they could really look into each other's eyes at that moment. And it also really helped with the mystery because it allowed for confession. And I was raised Catholic. I'm no longer Catholic, but that's how I was raised. And so that idea of these sacraments of confession and of last rites were things that I grew up around. And so I wanted to kind of find that importance, those sacred acts in this world. So there was a lot of invention, as you can now see, in what I created in the world, in order to make the story come to life. And that's why I put that author's note in there, so that there wouldn't be confusion that this really existed exactly as I said.
Right.
I wanted it to be clear.
So I did wonder, like, in your research, did you discover sort of where this practice sort of grew out of? Since you mentioned it was in Wales and it was sort of small, do you think it was a small Celtic rite, or like there was something that historical that it came from initially, or is it just a way to feed poor women?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Oh, and it wasn't just women historically; it was women and men. It was both.
Okay.
But so yeah, this is a really good question. So it definitely has. It's definitely syncretic in the sense that it doesn't come from just one religion. And I think that there must be some kind of pagan element to it, because it's certainly not Judeo-Christian, but it's got Judeo-Christian resonances, like the bread being like a ritual substance, and the idea of the scapegoat. So I think some historians suggest that maybe it started to fill the gap when Protestantism or Anglicanism arose and you no longer had the Catholic rite of confession. And then some people say it grew out of the old custom at British funerals of the wealthy. They would give out a dole, like basically charity, to people, and they'd often give out bread in exchange for prayers for the dead to poor people. So it could have arisen from this. But, no one has been able to pinpoint exactly what it came from. And it's so unusual. And some historians also say that one of the reasons we know so little about it is probably because it isn't a purely Christian ritual. The people who are practicing it may have not wanted to talk about it and share that they were doing it, because it may not have been approved of by the church. So there's so much mystery that I would love to know more about. I'd love to go talk to someone who, experienced this and try to find those origins, but I haven't been able to.
Like go back in time?
Yeah. I haven't been able to go back in time, number one. But no, number two, there's how little information there is can be frustrating.
Yeah.
Going along with that, was there ever a time where, because in the book, it's very, very clear pretty quickly that it is like a fantasy England.
Mm-hmm.
Was there ever a time where you were trying to root it more in history?
That's a really good question. So it happened pretty early because I realized that I wanted to make some changes, specifically to have sin eaters be widespread and be women and have it be kind of an institutional part of the Christianity in that world. And so I was like, well, what am I going to do? I really wanted to set it in, to have a lot of the issues in Elizabethan England are so fascinating to me. I love the fact that there's this female queen who can be a foil to this sin eater who's also a woman, but is the most powerless person versus, the most powerful person, but they're dealing with, in some ways, some of the same issues of finding agency in their own life. And I love the religious tensions that were going on in the Elizabethan period. They were perfect for what I wanted to explore. I love the Elizabethan period in general. I'm a historical fiction buff. So yeah, I had planned on historical fiction first, but pretty early on, I was like, I'm going to have to go alt history.
How did you decide on the foods? What foods would equal what sins?
That was really fun to do. So I love cooking, and I looked at a lot of Tudor cookbooks just to get ideas about what people would be eating. And then I also, honestly, I let my imagination go a little bit with that. I think that some of the qualities that I was hoping to find were the qualities that I really associate with folklore and folk tales and fairy tales, where when you get folk tales that have been passed down from generation to generation, they change a little bit over time because meanings change, names change, culture changes. And also I think they're a little bit like a game of telephone where just like in passing down stories, they change a little bit. And so sometimes you get to a fairy tale or a folk tale and you're like, what? That's really weird. Like I give this example of this fairy tale in Grimm's fairy tale that's about a bird, a cat, and a sausage. And all three of them are roommates and they live together and they all are sharing their tasks and and you're like, wait, what? Wait, let's go back. Let's rewind to like this sausage character. What? And like the sausage like makes soup by jumping into it and stirring itself around. And you're like, I think I'm missing something. Did someone like one day spell sausage and it was supposed to be squirrel? Like what? So I love that. And so I kind of wanted to try to find that with the food pairings where some of them you're like, oh yeah, I can see that. And some of them you're like, what? Because I kind of like that quality that I wanted to share that quality with the readers.
I've got a question from Olivia, who's working at the store, so she can't be here, but she said to please ask if you learned any interesting bits of history while doing book research that you didn't include in the book, like if there was something you loved learning about but just couldn't work it into the story.
That's a great question. So a couple of the things that are only touched on a little bit are like the poppet, the wax poppet that is found. There really was a wax poppet that was found that was made up to look like Queen Elizabeth, and it was found in Lincoln's Inn Field in London, and it was suspected witchcraft, but no one knows the origin of like how that happened. And the central mystery, which I'll in case other people try not to give anything away, but was based on a Privy Council investigation into the life of Queen Elizabeth, something that happened when she was 14, involving her and her stepfather. And so there were depositions of her ladies in waiting, and so that was a fascinating piece of history that I had no idea about. I think the only thing that didn't make it in was a little bit more about woad dyers, which I only mentioned really, really briefly, but they were only allowed to work like 5 miles away from a royal palace because their work smelled so bad. And they were kind of known because like their fingers were basically, they're working with this blue dye all the time. So they'd have like these purple, almost black fingertips. And people kind of avoided them because they had the smell of woad about them, which apparently smells like goat and stewed cabbage and urine and like everything awful put together. So I thought that was interesting, but it did not make it into the book.
Hard to capture smells in a book.
Yeah.
As a mystery that you're writing here, and the main character being illiterate, I thought that was a really interesting extra barrier to her investigative skills. Were you always setting out to write a mystery, or like was the mystery part of your original plan?
Yeah, I did know I wanted it to be a mystery. I was excited about that idea of, could you have this young woman who shouldn't be able to solve crime, in the sense that like all the typical societal judgments about who needs to solve crime, they need to be like Sherlock Holmes, they need to be smart and educated and of a privileged class and all of that. I liked turning that on its head a little bit.
I did think it was interesting, and I wonder why. I mean, I think I can guess why, but that there's such a code of honor among the sin eaters, because they are hearing the confessions and they are not allowed to talk anymore. And so, but it's not because their tongues are cut out or they have any sort of muzzle on them. They're actually, it's just a code of honor or ethic or something, maybe like the priests. But I can still imagine priests gossiping, but they gossip amongst themselves when she goes to another sin eater. Like there's no communication between the two. They have to form a bond without any voice.
Yeah, I was surprised that, like, I so totally expected that when May shows up at the older senator's house, that the older senator would like be so thankful to be able to talk to someone, but even she's like, no talking. Like, oh, okay, they're serious about this.
Yeah, I in order for the story to work, I kind of needed them to believe it and buy it, because otherwise they could dismiss it and it would be too easy. And yeah, I was really kind of inspired by, and I'm inspired just in the sense of the idea came from, not necessarily positively inspired, but by experiences in my life where people's faith was so strong. And I think that can be a really positive thing, and it can be a really destructive thing depending on how it manifests itself. And so, but I think that belief can be so strong that I wanted to try to portray that.
Yeah, because even the people who May was attending, who didn't necessarily believe it on the surface, still called for the sin eater to come to do it, and they still had to go through all the ritualization of that. That was pretty awesome. I liked that. It felt very authentic. Within the realm of the book, that this is how the people would behave, because they're dying and they're afraid and they need to confess.
Yeah.
And they need to hire a sin eater. I was going to ask you why you said it in the Elizabethan time, but I think you sort of answered that. I mean, it is a fascinating time period, because you've got witchcraft, you've got Christianity, you've got the morality place, the murmurs walking around, you have the leprosy, you have all
political
these
intrigue.
Political intrigue in Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Sort of wandering around all in one 6-year time period.
Yeah. And that's, I think, what originally got me interested in the Elizabethan time period was Shakespeare, because my background is in theater. And so that was definitely my introduction to that, and why I kind of wanted to go there more than other time periods. Like I definitely was like, oh, this is perfect, because I had a little bit of prior experience with it.
I thought May was a very interesting and strong character. I mean, for her to go from talking so much and questioning so much to total silence, it must have been very hard, but you kind of felt like that. You kind of felt some of her anguish anyway. I especially liked the part where she goes into the market and she's like, nobody can touch me. I'm just going to take all these things now.
Oh, yeah. She has her moment of realizing the power she actually has right now, because she can do anything and nobody will do anything about it because they just don't want to touch her or look at her.
Right. But that also felt like a genuine teenage thing. Like, fun. So I did think it was also interesting that you had the witches' marks that show up on the doorways. And she's like, why are all these people coming to my house, like all of a sudden to squat? She was powerless to get rid of them in some ways, but they ended up being friends in a way, or companions? Is it just sort of, so what made you bring them in?
Well, there were a couple things. Number one, I wanted her to have some human contact. Like, I mean, to a certain degree, you have to be really hard on your protagonist sometimes, but then you also, like, I couldn't be hard on her anymore. I had to give her something. But I also I liked the idea that she was gonna find these other people who are in her situation and eventually start to realize that they're her people, you know, and I wanted her to find her people and find her tribe, so to speak, so that she wasn't just alone anymore. But I think that can look in very different people, and we have our idea of what a group of friends is supposed to look like. But I wanted to kind of open up, well, you know, I think some of us have very untraditional ways of existing with other people and finding company. And so I enjoyed playing with that. And then also I was just trying to figure out, how do I do justice to this situation, her limitations, and the people that she actually could be around. And so some of it, the characters, you know, told me, so to speak, of like helped guide me of where it could go. But it was a lot of fun to get to write those characters because, especially with May being so silent, and then also because of her lack of education, in writing her, I really tried to reduce the vocabulary that I was using in her own thought processes. It was really fun to write the theater characters, for example, who are very verbose, because all of a sudden I get to go into total purple prose. And I was ready to do that after writing May.
Yeah, it's hard to write a silent character.
Yeah.
I was constantly looking for ways for her to get information from situations or from body language and that kind of thing.
Great. So you also have a scene where May discovers the keepsakes, I guess, of the other senators.
Yeah, I like to think of that as that's her maternal line, so to speak, because her actual family, like the Daffrys, are so awful that I like the idea that she taps into, you know, the idea of this is her grandma and her great grandma and her great great grandma, and these are people who she is going to share something with, and that she can connect with maybe in a way that she has not been able to with the rest of her family, and really feel like imagine their lives. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely hard to write. But there were a lot of things that were hard to write that would make me, you know, very sad as I was writing them. And I think partly because a lot of times when you're writing a book, even, I mean, this book is not autobiographical, but you're always writing, but you're always writing a little bit of, you know, your own feelings about things and your own connections. And so, yeah, and thinking about those women, you know, I think about that with my own relatives of like going back, what was it like, you know, great, 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 great grandmother? Did she feel the things that I feel, you know, when I'm struggling with my kids, or I'm thinking about what I'm doing with my life, or, you know, now that I'm in my 40s, you know, what was she thinking about at those times? So I really like, it's very sad, but I find it also kind of affirming to know that all of those women are kind of standing behind me, you know?
On the subject of May, though, did she like come into your head fully formed first, or did you kind of have the idea of Sin Eaters and then kind of create her? Or like, what was the order to what came to you first, and what moved you to write the story in that way?
So I knew that I wanted her to be young, kind of at that moment where, for me, when I was 14 years old, I was at the moment where I had all these assumptions about the world and who I was in the world, and they were all starting to break down a little bit. And I kind of had to understand myself anew and understand the world anew. And I think that happens to many people, not everybody, but that's an age where it often happens. And so I knew I kind of wanted to look at that. You know, I wanted to chart like this revolution in one woman's life, but it's not with her tearing down her world, it's in how she sees herself. And the idea that can be one of the most profound changes, or like the stepping stone to other changes. Because I was looking, you know, at May, who's the least powerful, and the Queen, who's supposedly the most powerful, but the Queen actually can't really tear down the structure, she's still stuck in a patriarchy that treats her as a second-class citizen, even though she's the queen. So like, to me, looking at this young woman, what kind of options does she have in a very powerless situation? And I think sometimes the only possibility you have is how you see yourself. But again, that can be a radical act.
Ultimately, I mean, you say that she is one of the most powerless persons, but the Sin Eater is one of the more powerful people, because you're getting all the confessions, plus you're well fed.
Yeah. No, in a world where that
in
is
a time where people are starving, you actually have.
Yeah, it's actually a nice situation to be in.
Especially since she initially gets into the situation for stealing bread because she was starving.
Yeah, it's sort of ironic.
Mhm.
But I guess it's the code that keeps the Sin Eaters from using that power, because it does seem like in the Elizabethan court there are certain people who are privy to secrets who then abuse that knowledge, abuse or manipulate that knowledge, or use it to get more power. But the Sin Eaters, who actually have all the knowledge and a lot of the power, are still so strong in adhering to the code because of their faith, as you said.
And what I would say is, like, look at our society. Women still don't get paid the same as men. And like, do we have less power than men? Maybe because we're obeying the code of society.
Yeah, snap.
Yeah.
Little feminism in there.
Bravo.
One of those social contract things where everyone just accepts, people tend to accept their role and go along with it. And it's certainly a lot easier to go along with the thing you're told to go along with than to fight against a giant system, especially for a young, uneducated girl who can barely count to 12. Like,
I was pretty interested in like the kind of hints at literacy and also just information that May was able to get, because so much of her knowledge about like what foods went with what crimes or stuff came from little folk songs and rhymes that she had been exposed to, but obviously that only contained some of the information that she needed, and then finding that book, but obviously she's almost entirely illiterate. And I really liked the like attention to detail regarding literacy, by the way, with her being able to recognize a handful of letters in her name, or know enough to piece together what a storefront was or something with a couple letters and some symbols and context clues. I was interested in where like the inspiration to build this whole set of folklore and like just little rhymes around the Sin Eater idea came from, because I really liked that touch.
I love nursery rhymes. I love fairy tales. I've got a ton of different collections of them, and every time, I'm always looking for new ones. My kids already can recite a bunch of them because I tell them all the time. So yeah, I think again it gets back to, I love that connection to the past, but also a little bit of the both the kind of magic that you feel in folklore and nursery rhymes, but also the whimsy. And I like that combination. So I love realizing, that London Bridge, that song is so old, and that kids might have sung this so long ago. To me, that's kind of a magical thing that these things get preserved. So yeah, most of it was wanting to share that, and then trying to also imagine, if you aren't literate, where does your information come from? How do you find these things out? And in a society that if doesn't have formal schooling, where is your information coming from? And it seems like songs and stories are critical.
just as a storytelling method, I thought it was having May be young and illiterate, you could have her still be a good vehicle to introduce the reader to this society that's familiar but not the same as what we're used to.
Yeah, and there was a moment where I was like, how am I going to get her to know who all of the court castle people are? And then I was like, she doesn't have to. She's just going to describe them by what they look like. And then the reader doesn't have to learn their names either. I'm just going to solve that problem. So that's how those names evolved.
Yeah,
Mhm.
mush face and
Yeah.
the willow tree. And so from doing a little online snooping, I see that you used to be a playwright or used to write plays. How is the process of writing a play different from writing a novel?
Well, the biggest limitation in plays is that you're limited to dialogue and stage directions. And I think that most people think about the dialogue part, like, okay, you can only express all the exposition and what people are actually saying, but you do also have stage directions. And I think that's something that people forget about, is like how people are moving and interacting with each other is a key piece of information. And so it was actually really helpful when writing this book. I think I leaned into the playwriting, especially when I had to do scenes where May needed information or needed to pass information and wasn't able to talk. I could kind of think about, okay, well, how would I do this in a play? I would have to have them stage it. So what's the physicality that could be used to express this? So that definitely carried through. But yeah, I mean, in a play, you're just so much, you're limited so much because you don't have internal monologue unless you're doing a musical and people are singing their thoughts. Don't get to do any of that. So everything has to be physicalized. And so that also helped me because, the old adage that you're supposed to show, not tell in books. And that's very easy in a play because it's all showing. So I think that I could kind of rely on that a little bit.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day for us, Megan.
Yeah, it's so nice to talk to you guys. Thank you guys so much for reading. I really appreciate it, and your astute thoughts and observations.
Have a lovely
Thanks for joining us.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Good night.